Mario Luna. Super clips, super clips.
You know, you have to understand heart attacks don't always kill you, obviously, right? But they do leave permanent scarring on the heart that never heals. Okay. So one of the most amazing studies looking at this it was published in 1964 or 1965. And since scarring on heart tissue is a surefire indicator of a heart attack, they looked at hearts in autopsy across different countries, because what they were trying to determine is heart disease genetic, or is it the result of the environment? So they looked at Americans, who were, lucky us, leading the world in heart disease, and then they looked at immigrant groups in America. They looked at Africans, Chinese, Japanese, and Koreans. The fellow who did this study was a Korean American doctor, right? And they did autopsies in the United States of those ethnic groups. And then they went back to their native countries and they did autopsies of those groups to discover what the rate of myocardial infarction, MI, was, because you can tell it at a heart attack, right? Even if you die of, you get hit by a truck walking across the street, they're going to be able to look at your heart in autopsy and say, oh, at some point this fellow had a heart attack, right? So what they discovered was the rate in white Americans was 20%. So 20% of Americans had heart attacks, right? 18% of Japanese Americans had heart attacks before they died. 12% of African Americans had heart attacks before they died. And then they went back and they looked at Japanese in Japan. And the rate was 3% in Tokyo and around 1% in the rest of the country. The overall rate was, in the low single digits compared to 18% in the United States.
18
then they looked at
versus 1%, same ethnicity. So same genes. So genetics.
Same genes. And the Japanese are a great example of that, because they hadn't been in the United States for very long, right? Unlike, say, African Americans, who had been here since the, 1800s. So there had been a lot of intermixture between African Americans and Americans. Then they went back to Africa and they looked at heart attacks in, I think it was Nigeria and Uganda. And I think it was in Nigeria, they did 4,500 autopsies. And I mean, they were very thorough about it. They brought a lot of the hearts back to the United States so they could make sure that the autopsies were being done in the same way, that there wasn't some bias, as you brought up, that it wasn't just a lack of being able to diagnose.
They are not able because they brought them to the USA and they follow with the same techniques, right?
Yes. So they were all very aware of the issue that you raised, and they wanted to make sure that they were controlling for it, because they understood that there were differences in practice in different countries and, in the practice of medicine.
45,000?
4,500 autopsies.
Okay. 4,500. Okay.
Now, remember, the rate of African Americans at that point was 12%. The 12%. Rate of heart attacks in the Africans was 0.
0?
They found one person with evidence of a heart attack, which rounds out to 0.
Okay, 0 dot whatever. Okay, very, very tiny.
Yes.
That's amazing.
So we knew in the 1960s that heart disease can be very rare, right? Can be very rare, that it doesn't have to be as common as we see it in the industrial countries. And there are lots of papers. I found a analysis looking at all these different populations who had hugely variant rates of heart disease around the world. I mean, this is a well-known phenomenon, although you will never hear it from a cardiologist nowadays, right? But we are not doomed to high rates of heart disease. It is not a natural human phenomenon. So my engineering mind says to me, what changed?
That's the question, because how can you single out this factor? Because one, if you want to play again devil's advocate, you will say, yes, but we don't know. We know for sure that you take the same Japanese person, you take them to the USA, and this lifestyle is really, really making him harm.
Right.
And with the African, even more so. But
many variables.
How do you know it's seed oils and not maybe sugar and other factors like processed food and radiation? I don't know. There are many factors. What makes you so convinced that the seed oils play a huge role in that percentage of?
So let's go through the cardiovascular research, right? This is the research that's done by organizations like the American Heart Association and other medical organizations, right? Nothing I'm going to describe to you is anything other than the research that doctors and scientists have done to try and figure out what to do about heart disease, right? So
yes, they don't read it the same way you read it. They don't interpret it the same way you do.
Oh, they do.
Do they?
They're just not honest about it, but we'll get into that.
Oh, okay. That's a different subject.
Okay. In the 1950s, a researcher named Ansel Keys did a lot of came up with this idea that saturated fat causes heart disease. What made him think that? He thought that so if you go look at a atherosclerotic plaque, right? So a heart attack is typically caused by, you get this atherosclerotic plaque, which is basically like a pus-filled cyst in your artery. This can burst. When it bursts, parts of it go up into your heart and block the blood flow to your heart. That's one of the major causes of a heart attack. Okay. So, very reasonable approach that he took. He looked in these things, and what you find in a plaque is a lot of cholesterol, even cholesterol crystals, right? Now, your body, cholesterol is this molecule that is a natural part of our body. It's essential for health. A lot of your membranes are made out of cholesterol, and so it's a perfectly normal part of your body.
The vitamin D, right?
Yes, vitamin D is made from cholesterol. Steroid hormones like testosterone and estrogen are made from cholesterol, right? So it's a normal part of your body. It's supposed to be there. But they found that it was built up in these plaques, which were causing heart attacks and causing people to die. And it's important to remember the problem with heart disease is the dying part, right? If you have atherosclerosis in your veins and it never has any effect on you and you live to 100 years old, who cares? It's the dying part early that's the problem. So anyway, along comes this researcher, Ansel Keys, who was quite famous in the United States. He, among other things, invented the K ration, which was the food that the American military used in World War II, right? K for Keys. So very, very famous American scientist. And he did a bunch of experiments where he looked at cholesterol in the blood, right? And he noticed cholesterol in the blood is carried around in these little particles that we now call LDL mostly. And what he noticed that is, if you fed somebody saturated fat, the cholesterol levels went up. And if you fed somebody polyunsaturated fat, the cholesterol levels went down. Okay. Now, since they thought that cholesterol was causing heart disease because plaques were full of cholesterol, they figured, hey, if we tell people to change their diets to lower their cholesterol, that should help them to live longer, right? Two problems with this. As Paul Dudley White, the father of American cardiology, pointed out, but we've been eating more and more of these vegetable oils since the early part of the 20th century when we didn't have any heart disease. And how is that going to make things better, right? So in 1961, Ansel Keys and the American Heart Association came out and told the entire country, and thereby the entire world, that people should eat more polyunsaturated fats because it will lower your blood cholesterol. And the hope, so this is the important thing to understand, they didn't have any evidence beyond that marker. right? They are correct most of the time, not always, but most of the time. Eating more polyunsaturated fats will lower your blood cholesterol and your LDL, right? But what they hadn't done was an experiment to find out if that would make you live longer, okay? So that was 1961. In 1965, a study called the Rose Corn Oil Trial was done, and they looked specifically at death and corn oil consumption. And what they found was that, yes, corn oil lowered your blood cholesterol, but people who ate more corn oil had more heart disease and died sooner. And their conclusion was that corn oil is not an appropriate treatment for heart disease because it causes more of it. Okay. So we're literally, I mean, I said that and everybody said, oh, you're joking, right? No physician would ever say, do this because it changes this marker, even though it makes you die earlier. But that is exactly what the American Heart Association was in the position of doing at that point, right? So then there were a couple of other studies that came out that showed the same thing, unfortunately. One famous study that was actually quoted by the American Heart Association in their recommendation, although the conclusions hadn't come out at that point when they made the recommendation, found that eating seed oils was actually worse for your heart health than smoking, which is pretty astonishing. So by the end of the 1960s, a number of these studies had come out showing that eating more polyunsaturated fats was bad for heart health. So the American Heart Association and Ansel Keys and the entire American medical infrastructure decided to do a national diet heart study to show this benefit. And what they found was that what we already knew, that it lowers your cholesterol, right? But they decided it was too big of a study and it was too hard to do. Ansel Keys continued his part of the study, which was called the Minnesota Coronary Survey and the Minnesota Coronary Experiment. And he wanted to show that this worked. This was his life work at this point, right? So he and another doctor, Ivan France, took hospital patients in Minnesota and they changed their diet and they went to great lengths to make sure that nobody could tell that they were changing the diet, right? Because you don't want, this is good scientific practice, right? There's placebo effects. So one of the ways to get around the placebo effect is that you don't know what the pill has, right? Yes. That's hard to do with dinner. And in fact, in Minnesota, it was illegal to sell butter it was illegal to serve butter in anything other than a square patty, right? So if you were served margarine at the dinner table, it had to be in a triangular patty, right? Really? And the butter was in a square patty by law in Minnesota. Well, Ivan France, this famous doctor, he actually got the Minnesota government to change the law so that he could always give the people in this study a rectangular patty and they wouldn't know if it was butter or margarine. Okay. So they went to amazing lengths to make sure that this was as thorough as possible. And to this day, this is the biggest study that's ever been done in humans to look at what effect polyunsaturated fats has in heart disease.
How's called that study? What's the name of that study?
The Minnesota Coronary Experiment.
The Minnesota Coronary Experiment.
Okay. So what did they find? Well, unfortunately, they found that the people who got more polyunsaturated fats were more likely to die. And what's worse is they found that the people who best responded to having their cholesterol lowered were the most likely to die. So what did they do? They finished their study early 1970s. They hid it.
They hid it, really?
They hid it. Ansel Keys, the two principal investigators.
That's
beg your pardon?
Really, that's worse than cherry picking. That's like really real fraud. Like it's almost criminal what you're saying.
Right. They didn't release the results until until 16 years later. And by that point, most people had forgotten about this study. Most people had forgotten about the National Diet Heart Study, right? And they came out and they kind of poo-pooed about what had actually happened. So years later, a researcher at the National Institutes of Health, Christopher Ramsden, who, for reasons we won't go into right now, had gotten interested in this topic of omega-6 and health, with a couple of other researchers who were similarly interested, decided to go back and look at all the studies that had given people various types of polyunsaturated fats and wanted to figure out what the actual effect was. And he went back and reanalyzed the Minnesota coronary experiment, right? He went to the son of Ivan France, who is a cardiologist at the Mayo Clinic, right? So the son is himself a doctor. And the son said, oh, Dad had all these boxes of papers from that study in the basement. Dad is dead. You know, we haven't cleaned out the house yet, but we will go with you and dig up all of this paperwork and figure out what happened in the study. And what they found was that they knew that the increased intake of polyunsaturated fats caused higher rates of death and cardiovascular disease. The student at the university had written his master's thesis looking at this, right?
What year?
So
again? What year did they uncover all these?
2016.
That's very recent. That's very recent, yes. So for years, the American Heart Association and all the cardiologists have been telling us that polyunsaturated fats are good for your heart. And as Christopher Ramsden discovered in going back and analyzing all of the studies that were actually done and finding evidence that wasn't released in the original studies, in the case of this and another study, found that in every one of these studies where they lowered saturated fat and increased the polyunsaturated fats from seed oils, more people died.